The media industry has been actively engaged in the FASB and IASB's joint project on revenue recognition, as the industry could experience significant changes. The final standard was issued in May of 2014. This podcast will provide you with the high-level summary of the new revenue standard, as well as some impacts that the standard may have on the media industry. My name is Brian Schilb, and with me today is Lauren Thomas. We are both on the Revenue Project team in KPMG's Department of Professional Practice. Lauren, can you start by giving an overview of the standard?
Sure, Brian. The core principle of the new revenue standard is that an entity recognizes revenue to depict the transfer of promised goods or services to a customer in an amount that reflects the consideration to which the entity expects to be entitled in exchange for those goods and services. The standard establishes a 5-step model for implementing the core principle. These 5 steps are: Step 1, identifying a contract with a customer. Step 2, identifying performance obligations in the contract. Step 3, determine the transaction price. Step 4, allocate the transaction price to the performance obligations. And finally, Step 5, recognize revenue when or as an entity satisfies a performance obligation. Let's move on now to talk about some of the potential impacts to media. One potential change under the new standard is accounting for fees from licensing intellectual property. In the media industry, licensing refers to granting a customer the right to use but not own intellectual property, such as motion pictures, music, and other forms of media content. Under the new standards, companies will first need to determine if the license is distinct from other goods and services promised in the agreement. If the license is not distinct, entities would apply the guidance in Step 5 of the model for bundled goods and services. If the license is distinct, entities would account for it separately from other goods and services and apply the application guidance on distinct licenses to determine if the customer is provided access to intellectual property as it exists throughout the license period, or the customer is provided a right to use the intellectual property as it exists at a point in time when the license is granted.
So Lauren, I think what you're saying is if it's an access right, then the performance obligation is satisfied over time. And if it's a right to use, then the performance obligation is satisfied at a point in time. And I think there are some criteria out there for determining whether or not it's over time. Can you talk to us about what those criteria are?
That's correct, Brian. There's 3 criteria that all must be met for a license to be an access right, with consideration being recognized over time. The first is the contract requires or the customer reasonably expects that the entity will undertake activities that significantly affect the intellectual property. Second, the rights granted by the license directly expose the customer to any positive and negative effects of the entity's activities. Third, the activities do not result in the transfer of a good or service to the customer as those activities occur.
Okay, a question on that. Should the other goods or services in the contract be considered when you're determining whether a license is point in time or over time?
As I mentioned earlier, if there's other goods and services in the contract, you first have to determine whether the license is distinct. If the license is not distinct, then generally the licensing guidance does not apply. If the license is distinct, then you ignore the other goods and services when determining the nature of the promise to transfer the license. The basis for conclusion says to think of this like a contract to provide a car and ongoing maintenance services. That is 2 distinct goods or services, and thus 2 performance obligations. You wouldn't think about the maintenance service when determining the nature and timing of the entity's performance related to the transfer of the car. The same goes for licenses. You would not consider other goods or services when assessing the nature of the promise to transfer a distinct license. The next item I would like to discuss is sales or usage-based royalties on licenses of intellectual property. Under the new standard, you would recognize revenue at the later of when the subsequent sales or usage occurs, or the satisfaction or partial satisfaction of a performance obligation to which the loyalty relates.
So let me ask you something. Does that requirement apply to sales of intellectual property when their license of intellectual property is embedded in other goods?
That's a good question, Brian, and it's not entirely clear. The Transition Resource Group discussed this at their first meeting. We generally think it would not apply to intellectual property embedded in other goods. However, we have to continue to monitor the developments on this question. The final item I would like to discuss is contract acquisition costs. Under the new standard, incremental costs to obtain contracts are required to be capitalized when the entity expects the cost to be recoverable and the amortization period is more than 1 year. Let's move on to talk about the effective date now. The effective date for public business entities and certain not-for-profit entities will be for periods beginning after December 15, 2016, which is January 1st, 2017 for a calendar year-end company. Under U.S. GAAP, early adoption is not permitted. All other entities will have a 1-year deferral for annual periods to 2018 for a calendar year-end company, and a 2-year deferral for interim periods. Although these entities are permitted to adopt in 2017 at the public business entity effective date.
Okay, switching gears again, can you touch briefly on the disclosure requirements?
Yes, under the new standard, they're going to expand significantly. There's both qualitative and quantitative disclosure requirements. The quantitative disclosure requirements will be required for quarterly reporting, including disaggregation of revenue, information about contract balances, contract costs, and the transaction price allocated to the remaining performance obligations. As companies think about their systems, processes, and controls, they should also be thinking about the data necessary to meet the disclosure requirements. Now let's talk about the transition approaches. Entities can select from 3 different transition approaches. The first transition approach is the full retrospective approach. Under this approach, an entity would recast all contracts for all prior periods presented. The second approach is the retrospective using 1 or more practical expedients. An example of a practical expedient would be not have to recasting contracts that began and ended in the same annual period. The third approach is the cumulative effect at date of adoption approach. Under this approach, an entity would record a cumulative effect adjustment at the beginning of the year of adoption. In addition, an entity would be required to account for the revenue transactions both under the new standard and legacy GAAP in the year of adoption to determine the effect of the accounting change, as well as provide disclosures in the period of adoption of the impact of the change on each financial statement line item.
Thanks, Lauren. And thanks to you, the listener, to our webcast today. For additional information, refer to KPMG's Financial Reporting Network website, including the latest on the revenue recognition page, which links to KPMG analysis of the new standard, defining issues, webcasts, and other podcasts.